The key turned in the lock with a soft click, and I pushed the door open, stepping into the cool, dimly lit apartment. The grocery bags in my hands were heavy, the plastic handles digging into my palms, but I barely noticed. I'd left work early, unable to focus, my mind buzzing with a vague sense of unease. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city outside. I set the bags on the kitchen counter, the thud of canned goods hitting the marble echoing through the space. As I began unpacking, a faint sound caught my attention, a rhythmic, almost melodic noise coming from down the hall. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a low murmur of voices and something else I couldn't quite place. I paused, a box of pasta in my hand, and listened. The sound was coming from James's room. My stepson was home, which wasn't unusual, but the nature of the noise was unsettling. Curiosity gnawed at me, mingling with a growing sense of dread. What was going on in there? I stepped into the hallway, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The sound grew clearer as I approached James's door, breaths low and urgent, punctuated by soft moans. My heart began to race, my palms damp with sweat. I shouldn't go in. I knew I shouldn't, but some inexplicable pull pushed me forward. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before turning it slowly. The door creaked open and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, casting a soft, golden glow over the scene. James and Sophie were on the bed, entangled in each other, their bodies moving in a rhythm that was achingly intimate. The air was thick with the scent of their passion, warm and musky, with a hint of something sweet, like vanilla. James's eyes snapped open, locking onto mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. His expression shifted from bliss to shock, his lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. Sophie let out a small gasp, her cheeks flushing crimson as she grabbed the blanket and pulled it over herself. "Oh my God," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." I didn't finish the sentence. I couldn't. My face burned with embarrassment as I stepped back, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I retreated to the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, my hands trembling as I tried to process what I'd just seen. James, my stepson, and Sophie, his girlfriend, together like that. The image was seared into my mind, vivid and inescapable. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing I'd invaded their privacy, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite name, a strange, unwelcome heat that spread through me, making my skin tingle. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water, gulping it down in an attempt to calm my racing heart. What was I supposed to do now? Pretend it never happened? Address it head-on? The thought of talking to James about it made my stomach turn. I busied myself with unpacking the groceries, trying to push the incident out of my mind, but it lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. The sounds, the smells, the look on James's face, they haunted me, replaying in my mind over and over. As I put the last can of soup in the pantry, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My breath hitched and I froze, bracing myself for the inevitable confrontation, but the footsteps passed by, heading toward the bathroom, and I let out a shaky sigh of relief. For now, all I could do was wait and hope that the heat in my cheeks would fade before I had to see them again. I stood at the stove, stirring the pot of pasta sauce absent-mindedly, my thoughts still tangled in the awkwardness of the afternoon. The apartment smelled of garlic and tomatoes, a comforting aroma that did little to ease the tension coiled in my chest. The sound of a door opening down the hall made my hand freeze mid-stir. James and Sophie were coming out of his room. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on the food. The last thing I needed was to burn dinner on top of everything else. I heard their footsteps approaching the kitchen, their soft murmurs barely audible over the sizzle of the sauce. "Hey," James said, his voice tentative as he stepped into the kitchen. I turned, forcing a smile onto my face. "Hey. Dinner's almost ready." He nodded. his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. Sophie stood behind him, her arms crossed over her chest, her face still flushed from earlier. She offered me a small, awkward smile. And I responded with what I hoped was a reassuring nod. "Smells good," Sophie said, her voice soft. "Thanks," I replied, turning back to the stove. "It's just pasta. Nothing fancy." The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I busied myself with serving the food, hoping the act of moving would dispel some of the tension. When I turned back, James and Sophie were already seated at the table, their eyes downcast, their hands fidgeting. I set the plates down and took my seat, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The clinking of utensils filled the room as we began to eat, the silence almost unbearable. I glanced up at James, who was poking at his food with his fork, his jaw tight. Sophie sat beside him, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on her plate. The sound of a fork scraping against porcelain made me wince. I cleared my throat, searching for something, anything to say. "So, how was your day?" I asked, my voice too loud in the quiet room. James looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Fine. Yours?" "Busy," I replied, taking a sip of wine. "Work's been hectic." He nodded, and silence settled over us again. I took another sip of wine, the cool liquid doing little to calm my nerves. After what felt like an eternity, James cleared his throat. "Did you hear about that storm they're predicting for the weekend?" I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in topic. "Oh, yeah. I heard something about that." He leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing on his lips. "Guess we're all gonna be stuck inside. Better stock up on snacks." Sophie let out a soft laugh, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Or board games. Remember that time we tried to play Monopoly?" James groaned, rolling his eyes. "Don't remind me. I still owe you like $1 million. I chuckled, the tension in the room finally beginning to ease. Monopoly's a dangerous game. I've seen friendships end over it. James grinned, his usual confidence returning. "Yeah, well, Sophie's ruthless. I'm pretty sure she's secretly an accountant." Sophie smirked, nudging him with her elbow. "Someone's gotta keep you in check." We laughed, the sound light and genuine, and for a moment, the awkwardness of the afternoon seemed to fade. As the meal progressed, the conversation flowed more naturally. We talked about work, the latest headlines, and a movie we'd all seen recently. It felt normal, almost. But as I refilled my wine glass, the memory of what I'd walked in on earlier crept back into my mind. The way they'd been tangled together, the look on James's face when he saw me. It was impossible to forget. I glanced at them, their heads close together as they whispered something to each other, and felt a strange mix of curiosity and discomfort stirring inside me. The wine had loosened my tongue, and before I could stop myself, I leaned forward, my voice low but firm. "You know, there are some specifics you two could improve on." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. James and Sophie froze, their eyes widening as they turned to look at me. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice cautious. I hesitated, realizing too late that I'd crossed a line, but there was no turning back now. "I mean," I said, choosing my words carefully, "if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right." Sophie's face flushed, and James stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I'd ruined everything, the fragile peace we'd just found. But then he chuckled, shaking his head. "Wow, Claire," he said, smirking. "Didn't know you were an expert." I raised an eyebrow, trying to hide my nerves. "I've been around the block a few times." Sophie giggled, her embarrassment fading. "Well, maybe you could give us some pointers." The comment caught me off guard, and I laughed, the tension in the room dissolving once again. But as the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. A boundary had been crossed, and I wasn't sure what it meant for them or for me. The days that followed were strange. A heavy, unspoken tension lingered in the air, like the quiet before a storm. James and Sophie avoided bringing up the topic of that dinner conversation. And so did I. But it was there, lurking beneath the surface of every interaction. I'd catch James glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, his expression a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. Sophie would blush whenever our eyes met, her gaze darting away quickly. The air between us felt charged, electric, as if we were all waiting for something, anything to happen. I told myself to let it go. It wasn't my place to meddle in their relationship, no matter how much that dinner conversation had opened their door. But the memory of what I'd seen, what I'd said, kept replaying in my mind. And then, there was the book. I'd found it in the back of my closet, buried under a pile of old photo albums and forgotten knickknacks. It was a book about lovemaking, one I'd bought years ago during a phase when I'd been trying to spice things up in my own marriage. I'd never actually read it, but the title alone seemed promising. One afternoon, while James and Sophie were out, I left the book on the coffee table, its cover facing down to avoid drawing too much attention. I told myself it was just a suggestion, a gentle nudge in the right direction, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. That evening, I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when James walked in, the book in his hand. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to keep my focus on the cutting board. "Claire," he said, his voice uncertain. I looked up, feigning surprise. "Hey, James. What's up?" He held up the book, his expression unreadable. "Is this yours?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, yeah. I found it while cleaning out my closet. Thought it might be helpful." He raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a small smirk. "Helpful, huh?" I shrugged, turning back to the vegetables. "Just thought you might find it interesting." He was silent for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me. Then he stepped closer, leaning against the counter. "Have you read it?" I shook my head, keeping my gaze fixed on the cutting board. "No. Like I said, I just found it." He hummed, flipping through the pages. "It's detailed." I chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, that's the point, isn't it?" He was quiet again, and I could feel the tension building between us. Then he cleared his throat. "Sophie and I were talking, and we thought maybe you could give us some advice." My stomach dropped, and I turned to face him, my knife still in hand. "Advice?" He nodded, his expression serious now. "You know, like you said at dinner, if you're up for it." I stared at him, my mind racing. This wasn't what I'd expected, not at all, but the idea intrigued me, sparking a curiosity I couldn't ignore. "Are you serious?" I asked, trying to gauge his reaction. He shrugged, his smirk returning. "Why not? You've got the experience, right?" I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. This was a line I'd never thought I'd cross, but the thought of saying no felt wrong. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steady despite the nerves churning in my stomach. "I'll help you." The tension between us shifted, becoming something deeper, more charged. James's smirk widened, and he nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Great," he said, his voice low. "We'll let you know when we're ready." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, the book still in his hand. I stood there, my heart racing, the knife still clenched in my hand. What had I just agreed to? The first session was awkward. I sat in the corner of James's room, perched on a chair I'd brought in from the kitchen, trying to look as composed as possible. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn to block out the evening sun, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. James and Sophie were on the bed, their bodies close but not yet touching, their eyes flickering nervously toward me. "Okay," I said, my voice steady despite the knot of unease in my stomach. "Let's start with the basics. They nodded, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and determination. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay clinical, detached. This wasn't about me, it was about helping them. Communication is key, I began, my tone professional. Talk to each other. Let each other know what feels good and what doesn't. James and Sophie exchanged a glance, then nodded again, their movements stiff. Okay, James said, his voice slightly unsure. We can do that. Sophie gave him a small smile, her fingers brushing against his. Yeah. Let's try. The tension in the room was palpable as they began to undress. James pulled off his shirt, revealing his lean, muscular frame, the faint sheen of sweat already glistening on his skin. Sophie followed, her hands trembling slightly as she unbuttoned her blouse. I averted my gaze momentarily, feeling a strange mix of discomfort and curiosity. They were vulnerable, exposed, and yet there was a quiet confidence in the way they moved. Sophie's bra fell to the floor, revealing her soft, delicate curves, while James's jeans were discarded, leaving him in just his boxers. The room grew warmer, the air thick with the scent of their desire. I cleared my throat, trying to maintain my composure. Go slow, I instructed, my voice softer now. Touch her gently, James. Don't rush. He nodded, his eyes locked on Sophie's as he reached out to cup her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her breath hitching as he leaned in to kiss her. Their movements were cautious at first, almost tentative. But as they followed my guidance, they began to relax, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that was both hesitant and beautiful. Good, I said, my voice steady despite the heat creeping up my cheeks. Now, Sophie, guide him. Show him what you like. She nodded, her hands sliding down his chest as she leaned in to whisper something in his ear. James's eyes darkened, his hands moving to her waist as he responded to her cues. The session continued, the room growing warmer and more intimate with each passing moment. I offered feedback when needed, pointing out nuances and encouraging them to explore new dynamics. Try this, I suggested at one point, gesturing to James. Use your hands more. Touch her here. He followed my instruction, his movements growing more confident as he explored Sophie's body. She gasped, her back arching as he touched her in a way that clearly resonated with her. That's it, I murmured, my voice low and encouraging. Just like that. Over time, the sessions became more frequent and James and Sophie grew more comfortable with my presence. The atmosphere in the room became increasingly charged. The connection between them, and by extension me, deepening with each passing moment. One evening, after a particularly intense session, something shifted. James stepped away from Sophie, his breathing heavy, his skin glistening with sweat. He turned to me, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite name. Claire, he said, his voice low and husky. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Yes? He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Before I could react, he leaned in and kissed me, his lips warm and insistent. The world seemed to stop, my mind racing with a jumble of thoughts and emotions. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped him. But I didn't. The heat of his body, the intensity of his kiss, it was too much, too overwhelming. I felt myself leaning into him, my hands trembling as they reached for his shoulders. Just as I thought the moment couldn't get any more intense, I felt another presence beside me. Sophie had moved closer, her hands resting on my hips as she leaned in to kiss me as well. Her lips were soft, her touch hesitant but full of curiosity. The double sensation, James's firm demanding kiss and Sophie's gentle exploratory one, was almost too much to bear. My mind raced, my body responding instinctively as I kissed them both, the boundaries between us blurring until they were almost indistinguishable. When they finally pulled away, I was left breathless, my mind reeling. I stared at them, my heart pounding, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of confusion and desire. Claire, Sophie whispered. Her voice barely audible. I didn't respond, unable to find the words. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. I had no idea what this meant for them, for me, but I knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same. The kiss ignited a fire within me, a wave of emotions that I couldn't and didn't want to ignore. James's hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, his touch firm yet gentle. His lips were insistent, demanding, and I found myself responding instinctively, my hands gripping his shoulders for support. Sophie was already nearby, her presence palpable. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was intense, her breath hitching as she watched us. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "Claire," James murmured against my lips, his voice low and husky. I pulled back slightly, my mind racing. "James, we shouldn't dash." He silenced me with another kiss, his hands sliding down to my hips. "Yes, we should." I felt a surge of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the desire coursing through me. My body was responding in ways I couldn't control, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could protest further, I felt Sophie's hand on my arm, her touch warm and tentative. "Claire," she said softly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "It's okay." I turned to look at her, my breath catching in my throat. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted, and there was a vulnerability in her expression that made my heart ache. Her fingers brushed against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her cheeks flushed. I want this." James's arms tightened around me, his breath warm against my ear. "We both do." The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with anticipation. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to walk away, but my body had other ideas. Slowly, hesitantly, I allowed them to guide me to the bed, my heart racing with every step. Sophie sat down on the edge of the bed first, her hands reaching out to pull me toward her. As I sat beside her, James knelt in front of me, his hands moving to my face as he kissed me again, his lips warm and insistent. At the same time, Sophie leaned in, her lips brushing against my neck, her breath hot against my skin. The sensation was overwhelming. My mind spinning as I tried to process everything. James's hands were everywhere, his touch firm and confident, while Sophie's was soft, exploratory. "Claire," Sophie whispered against my skin, her voice trembling. "Is this okay?" I nodded, my breath hitching. "Yes." The room was alive with sensation, every touch, every breath, every whispered word amplified in the dim light. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, but my body was fully present, responding to the heat between us in ways I couldn't control. James's hands were everywhere, his touch both familiar and foreign. He kissed me with a hunger that left me breathless, his lips trailing down my neck, my collarbone, every inch of my skin tingling under his attention. His fingers traced the curve of my waist, the dip of my hip, his movements deliberate and confident. I could feel the strength in his hands, the way he held me as if he never wanted to let go. Sophie was beside me, her presence adding another layer of complexity to the moment. Her touch was softer, more tentative, but no less electrifying. She kissed my shoulder, her lips warm against my skin, her fingers intertwining with mine. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze, a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "Claire," she whispered again, her voice trembling. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes, I'm sure." Her smile was soft, almost shy, and she leaned in to kiss me again, her lips brushing against mine in a way that felt both innocent and deeply intimate. James's hands were still moving, his touch sending waves of pleasure through me, and the combination of the two was overwhelming. The room was filled with the sounds of our passion, the ragged breathing, the soft rustle of sheets, the occasional gasp or moan. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and arousal, the heat between us almost unbearable. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the moment. My reservations, my guilt, my fear, it all faded into the background, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection between us. This was wrong, I knew that. But in that moment, it felt right. James's hands moved to the buttons of my blouse, his fingers trembling slightly as he undid them one by one. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely liberated. His eyes met mine, and there was something in his gaze that made my heart skip a beat, a mix of curiosity, desire, and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. Sophie's hands joined his, her touch gentle and reassuring. She leaned in to kiss my shoulder, her lips warm against my skin, her breath hot and steady. "You're beautiful," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. I felt a lump form in my throat, my cheeks burning with a mix of embarrassment and pleasure. "So are you," I replied, my voice shaky. James's lips trailed down my neck, his hands exploring my body with a confidence that was both thrilling and intimidating. At the same time, Sophie's fingers traced patterns on my skin, her touch light but electrifying. The sensation was overwhelming, my mind spinning as I tried to process everything. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering between fear and exhilaration. "Claire," James murmured against my skin, his voice low and husky, "let go." I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. Then with a deep breath, I closed my eyes and surrendered. The connection between us was undeniable, the chemistry between the three of us electric. It was as if we were three puzzle pieces, each one incomplete on their own, but perfect when put together. As the evening progressed, the boundaries between us dissolved, the lines blurring until we were no longer separate entities, but a tangled, intimate trio. The room was filled with the sounds of our passion, the heat between us almost unbearable. When it was over, we lay tangled together, our breathing slowly returning to normal. The room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. I turned to look at James and Sophie, their faces flushed and their eyes shining with something I couldn't quite name. "Claire," Sophie said softly, her hand resting on my arm. "Are you okay?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." "Are you?" She smiled, her expression soft. "More than okay." James reached over, his fingers brushing against my cheek. This changes everything, doesn't it?" I hesitated, my mind racing. "Yes," I said finally, "but I don't regret it." Neither did they, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting a warm, golden glow over the kitchen. I stood at the counter, my hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, the rich aroma grounding me in the moment. My mind was still reeling from the events of the previous night, the memory of their touch, their warmth, their desire lingering like a vivid dream I couldn't shake. The sound of footsteps made me turn, my heart skipping a beat as James entered the room. His hair was tousled, his shirt rumpled, and there was a softness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. He gave me a small, tentative smile as he grabbed a mug from the cabinet and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said, his voice low and rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest. Sophie appeared a moment later, her hair pulled back into a loose braid, her face free of makeup. She looked radiant, her cheeks flushed with a healthy glow, and her eyes bright with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "Good morning," she said softly, her gaze flickering between James and me. "Morning," we both echoed, the word hanging in the air like a shared secret. The three of us stood in the kitchen, the silence stretching between us. It wasn't awkward exactly, but it was charged with something unspoken, something that needed to be addressed. Sophie was the first to speak. "So, last night happened," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I glanced at her, my grip tightening on my mug. "It did." James leaned against the counter, his eyes on me. "And how do you feel about it?" I hesitated, my mind racing as I tried to find the right words. How did I feel? Guilty? Exhilarated? Confused? Alive? It was a world.